Breaking news. What began as a routine trade discussion between two world leaders has exploded into one of the most heated diplomatic confrontations of the decade. Moments ago, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi publicly slammed British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, accusing him of colonial arrogance and trade war. The statement came live from New Delhi, and within minutes, social media erupted. British markets trembled, and diplomats across London scrambled to contain the political firestorm. For weeks, quiet tension had been building behind closed doors. Starmer's new trade proposal, described by Labour insiders as a bold reset with India, was anything but bold to Delhi. The plan included strict tariffs on Indian tech exports, a demand for British oversight in manufacturing regulations, and a clause that essentially allowed the UK to veto certain Indian industrial subsidies. In simple terms, it was a blueprint for economic control, dressed up as partnership. When details leaked, Modi's government was furious. For India, this wasn't about numbers, it was about dignity. A nation that once lived under British rule was being told again what it could or couldn't produce. And Modi, ever the symbol of India's assertive rise, would not stay silent. In a fiery statement outside Parliament, Modi declared, "India does not bow to those who still think in the shadows of empire." The crowd roared. The line was replayed across every Indian channel. In the UK, however, silence. Starmer's office issued no response, not at first. But inside Downing Street, aides were panicking. Trade negotiators warned that a collapse in talks could cost Britain billions in post-Brexit exports. Yet Starmer doubled down, insisting the UK must set higher ethical standards for trade. To India, those words sounded like hypocrisy. Ethical standards from a nation still grappling with its own political scandals, economic crises, and royal controversies. The Indian media tore the phrase apart. Overnight, hashtags like Modi versus Starmer and New Empire War dominated global feeds. Indian commentators framed it as the rebirth of colonial defiance, Britain clinging to power it no longer had. And then came the laughter. At a press conference in Delhi, a journalist asked Modi whether he feared a trade war with the United Kingdom. Modi smiled, paused for a moment, and said simply, "Trade war? My friend, wars are fought between equals." The room erupted in applause. That single line hit harder than any sanction. In London, it was humiliation. The Prime Minister's press secretary struggled to contain the fallout. Financial papers described the comment as a diplomatic dagger. Even the palace was rumoured to be uneasy. King Charles reportedly asked aides for a briefing on the crisis, worried about the Commonwealth implications. Behind the scenes, Labour MPs began turning on their own leader. Some accused Starmer of reigniting anti-UK sentiment across Asia. Others whispered that he was out of his depth in global politics. A lawyer trying to play empire. Even Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, was said to be deeply concerned about the market reaction. The pound began to slide. Investors pulled out of Indian ventures, and the British media, once loyal to Starmer's narrative of steady leadership, began to shift tone. Headlines turned brutal. Modi laughs as Starmer falters. But the storm wasn't just economic, but it was moral. Across Britain's Indian diaspora, voices rose in anger. Community leaders accused Starmer of treating India as a junior partner, not a sovereign equal. In Birmingham, Manchester and Leicester, protesters gathered, waving both Union Jacks and Indian flags, chanting, "Respect India, respect the future." Meanwhile, in India, Modi's popularity surged even higher. The image of a strong leader standing tall against old Western pressure became a national symbol of pride. Indian commentators described it as the moment Britain realised it no longer ruled the global game. And yet the real danger was only beginning. Intelligence insiders leaked that both governments had quietly suspended diplomatic back channels. Trade advisors were recalled. Flights for a scheduled UK delegation were abruptly cancelled. One official was overheard saying, "We're witnessing the death of the Commonwealth spirit." By the end of the week, relations were in free fall, and still neither side blinked. Modi refused to apologise. Starmer refused to retreat. What began as words was now spiralling into policy. London was preparing sanctions on Indian data firms. Delhi was threatening to block British imports in retaliation. The global press called it the new economic Cold War, the question now haunting every corridor of power in both nations: who will flinch first? As Britain's influence crumbles and India's confidence rises, one question remains hanging in the air. Has the sun finally set on Britain's global power, or is Modi about to push it into permanent darkness? Inside Downing Street, the mood was grim. The blinds were drawn. Aides whispered in corners. Keir Starmer sat at the head of the long, polished table, eyes sunken, jaw tight, as his security advisor read the latest intelligence briefing aloud. India had officially frozen all trade consultations and withdrawn its delegation from London. Across the world, headlines painted the moment in the harshest light. Modi defies Britain. The empire finally falls. India stands tall. UK scrambles. The symbolism was unbearable for a government already struggling to maintain control. Post-Brexit trade deals had been Starmer's lifeline, his promise to rebuild Britain's global role. But with India's sudden defiance, that promise was shattered. The narrative of a global Britain had turned into a tragic irony, a former empire now begging for deals it could no longer dictate. Inside the cabinet, tempers flared. Rachel Reeves accused the Prime Minister of provoking a superpower for the sake of moral posturing. David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, warned of economic isolation. Even some loyal MPs began calling the crisis Starmer's Suez moment a humiliation, echoing the 1956 collapse of Britain's global dominance. Meanwhile, in India, Narendra Modi was everywhere. The Indian press turned the diplomatic rupture into a national festival of pride. Television channels replayed his line, "Wars are fought between equals every hour." Crowds chanted his name in Delhi, Mumbai and Hyderabad. Social media flooded with memes of a roaring lion standing over the crumbling image of Big Ben. The message was clear: India was done being lectured. But behind the triumph, Delhi's corridors of power were cold and calculating. Modi's advisors met in secret to discuss the next move: economic retaliation. They began drafting a plan to restrict British companies' access to India's booming tech market. Vodafone, Barclays, Rolls-Royce all risked massive losses if the Indian government pulled the plug. It wasn't just politics. It was payback. Back in London, the British establishment began to fracture. The City of London, it took that ancient heart of British finance, turned against its own government. CEOs demanded Starmer end the feud immediately. Markets dipped further. The pound hit a 6-month low. Even King Charles was drawn into the chaos, reportedly urging Starmer during a private audience to preserve the dignity of the realms. That's fine, but Starmer refused to yield. He told his advisors Britain cannot afford to be seen bowing to foreign intimidation. It was a line that sounded noble in theory, but disastrous in practice. Across social media, the backlash was brutal. Influencers mocked Starmer's defiance as stubborn arrogance. Indian diaspora leaders appeared on talk shows demanding an apology. The BC's political editor described the moment as the deepest collapse in UK-India relations since independence. And then came the leak. Late one evening, an anonymous document surfaced online. It was marked Confidential UK Trade Office. Inside were explosive notes from a meeting weeks earlier, allegedly showing that Starmer's inner circle had planned to limit India's market dominance and retain control of key technological sectors to prevent global power imbalance. The phrase retain control was enough to ignite fury. To the Indian public, it sounded exactly like what Modi had warned of, a new form of colonial control disguised as diplomacy. By midnight, protesters had gathered outside the British High Commission in Delhi, waving signs that read, "Britain still thinks it rules us." Starmer's government went into lockdown. Press conferences were cancelled. No one spoke publicly for 48 hours, but silence in the modern world is death. The outrage only grew louder. In Parliament, opposition voices tore into the Prime Minister. Nigel Farage appeared on live television, calling Starmer the most tone-deaf leader in British history. On social media, the trending tag #BritainFalling became an international phenomenon. Meanwhile, Modi stood calm, even amused. At a rally in Gujarat, he told supporters, When we were weak, they called us partners. Now that we are strong, they call us threats. The crowd thundered in applause. That clip alone racked up 50 million views overnight. For India, this was not just politics, it was poetic justice. For Britain, it was the slow, painful realisation of a changing world order. As the days passed, whispers of retaliation turned into action. India began quietly shifting defence contracts to France and Japan. Trade deals, once earmarked for London, were redirected to Singapore. And yet Starmer still believed he could salvage his image. He prepared a bold public address, a speech meant to steady the ship, to remind the nation that Britain would not be bullied by any power, east or west. But when the cameras rolled, the speech fell flat. His voice trembled. His words sounded hollow. Commentators called it a man trying to act powerful in a world that no longer believes him. That night, even the loyal British press began to turn. Newspaper headlines screamed, "Modi laughs, Britain bleeds, the fall of the empire, how Starmer lost India." And in living rooms across the UK, ordinary citizens began asking a question their leaders dreaded. If Britain can't command respect abroad, can it even command faith at home? The storm was far from over, because as Britain struggled to regain its footing, a secret message was making its way across diplomatic channels, one that would threaten to shatter what little trust remained. What shocking truth was hidden inside that encrypted transmission, and could it expose the real reason this crisis began in the first place? The final act of the crisis began in silence. It was late evening in London when the encrypted message reached number 10. The Prime Minister was in his office, surrounded by a small circle of advisers. The message was brief. 6 lines written in coded diplomatic language, but its meaning was unmistakable. India had discovered something that, if made public, could destroy what remained of the UK's global credibility. The leak came from within Britain's own Trade and Intelligence Division. It revealed that months before the dispute began, Starmer's administration had secretly authorised surveillance on Indian financial networks under the pretext of trade risk monitoring. In other words, British intelligence had been spying on Indian business data. When the truth reached New Delhi, Modi's reaction was swift and merciless. Within hours, the Indian government expelled several British diplomats. The press in Delhi ran front-page banners, exposed Britain's secret spy operation on India. The Indian Foreign Minister went live on national television saying, "We are not subjects, we are equals. Those who still act like colonial masters will face consequences." The fallout was instantaneous. Downing Street denied everything, but the evidence was overwhelming. Emails, server logs, internal memos, all pointing to direct oversight from senior officials close to Starmer himself. The Prime Minister's office became a fortress of panic. Advisers deleted phones, civil servants whispered about resignations. The Foreign Office went dark, refusing to comment on the unauthorised data collection. By morning, the entire world was watching. News channels from Washington to Canberra carried the same headline: "India strikes back, Britain exposed." For the first time in decades, it wasn't Britain leading an investigation. It was being investigated. As markets reeled, Britain's moral authority collapsed. The very government that preached transparency and ethics had been caught in one of the most audacious intelligence overreaches since the Snowden era. And Modi, calm, poised, smiling, became the symbol of global defiance. He didn't just defeat a policy, he humiliated a legacy. In London, the backlash turned inward. Protesters flooded Westminster chanting, "Step down, Starmer!" Labour MPs distanced themselves, claiming they had no knowledge of the operation. Rachel Reeves privately told allies that the Prime Minister has lost control. Newspapers called it the Great Betrayal. One front page showed Starmer's photo beside the words "caught lying to the world." And yet, through it all, Starmer refused to resign. He insisted that Britain had acted to protect its national interests. But the words rang hollow. Even his allies could see it. The tone, the tremor, the quiet desperation in his voice, the public had stopped believing. Meanwhile, across the globe, Modi emerged as the face of a new order. At a rally in New Delhi, he addressed a roaring crowd of thousands. "For centuries," he said, "we were told to listen. Today, it is our turn to speak." India bows to none. The speech was broadcast live to millions, shared endlessly online, hailed as the moment the world turned east. Back in Britain, the consequences deepened. Commonwealth nations began questioning old alliances. The pound fell again. Investors fled. Even the royal family could no longer stay silent. King Charles, in a rare public statement, urged both sides to seek mutual respect and reconciliation. But to the public, it sounded like too little, too late. The cracks in the empire were now visible to the world. For generations, Britain had held on to the illusion of its moral leadership. The idea that it could guide others through diplomacy, reason and old prestige. But the Modi-Starmer confrontation had ripped that illusion apart. The story was no longer about trade or tariffs. It was about truth, power and the shifting balance of history. In one final act of desperation, Starmer reached out privately to New Delhi. A back-channel message was sent through an intermediary, an offer of apology, quiet negotiations and the promise of a new trade deal. But by then, the narrative had already escaped his control. The story belonged to the world. Modi didn't need to respond. His silence said everything. In India, fireworks lit the sky as news anchors called it the moment the empire bowed. In Britain, the streets were cold, the government fractured and public trust at its lowest in decades. The era had changed. The teacher had become the student. The empire that once ruled the seas now struggled to stay afloat in the tides of a new century. As dawn broke over London, the Prime Minister's motorcade moved through the empty streets towards Buckingham Palace. No one knew if he was going to resign or beg for royal intervention. The cameras stayed fixed, waiting for the next move in a drama that had consumed two nations and captured the world. Because this wasn't just a political collapse, it was the symbolic death of British dominance and the rise of a new global power that no longer needed Western approval. And as the world held its breath, one question echoed across both continents: has Britain finally fallen from the world stage, or is this only the beginning of a much darker reckoning yet to come?